So we were together about 5 years when my stepfather passed away. And when I got the news, I literally laid down on the floor. I was alone in my house. I'm just feeling the impact of it even now. I felt safer in the world than I had ever felt before. And I just put my hand on my heart. It was like this sort of grace was washing over me, and it was a visceral experience. And my conscious thought is like, this isn't what you're supposed to feel when someone dies. Like, geez, how selfish. Like, I was grateful that he was gone. Even though we didn't have that much contact over the years, he was still married to my mother until the day he died. So he was always in my orbit. And therefore, he was always influencing me in this way that was really brutal. Because what I came to understand is that my stepdad is a classic narcissist, someone who has narcissistic personality disorder. And so all of that, what I just had previously kind of related to active alcoholism, I've come to understand that, yes, it was that. And it was a host of other things that we see with narcissism, including gaslighting. So gaslighting is intentionally manipulating someone so that they literally question not only what happened, but their entire reality, their relationship to themselves. You know, he isolated us, moved us out into the middle of nowhere in the mountains and kept us all really kind of separate. He pitted our siblings against one another. And there was a real grooming of me as a young girl, where I now know he had a pattern of grooming young girls to be their girlfriend or wife. And, you know, my mom was his third marriage at this point, and he was doing it with me, what he had done with women before my mom. And I kind of knew it, but it wasn't so overt that I didn't ever really know. And so part of what I'm learning from feedback related to my story as it relates to childhood trauma in general is that there is this like, did it really happen? Was it that bad? And in part that happens because when you're a child, and again, we go back to this lens and language of trauma and the nervous system and safety, we are developmentally hardwired for relationship, right? We're not someone who comes into the world when we're born and we can function on our own. We literally need our caregivers to feed us and bathe us and clothe us. And so we are wired for relationship. So we come into the world with this, like, I need you because my survival depends on you. So what often happens with childhood trauma is when we are not taken care of or seen or attended to, in all the ways that that can happen, the child has to privilege the relationship above all else because they don't exist if the relationship doesn't exist. So they internalize it must be me. I can't make my caregiver bad because I need them to survive. Right. So I had part of that going on just developmentally, like I have to solve this problem in me. It must be me. It can't really be them. And then I had all of this gaslighting that wasn't only being directed at me, but in the case of my stepdad with my mom, he convinced my mom that I was the liar. I was the manipulator. Often what narcissists do is they take all of these things that they're doing and they project it onto the victim. And they're the ones that are all bad, right? And so he convinced partially me of those things, and he 100% convinced my mom of those things, so that when I did finally have a voice and say, there is stuff going on here that is really bad, and school counselors were saying it's really bad, and social services was brought in, my mom said, ooh, I believe that you believe that that's happening, Ingrid, but I don't believe that it is. There's a lot more there that I obviously go into in the book, but I kind of want to fast forward to like, what does all of this have to do with this marriage of trauma, childhood trauma, complex trauma? Complex trauma is relational trauma, and what that has to do with recovery generally speaking, because my stepdad died. And I was struck with all these stories that I had to write. To this day, I can't believe what happened and how it happened. But I'd be woken up in the middle of the night, night after night, with these like scenes and stories, not just from my childhood, but all of those dysfunctional relationships and all of the ways that I had tried to cope that didn't quite get me there. It was like these individual essays, and I didn't know how they related or hung together or why they were coming. I thought, am I like meant to be sharing about what it means to be a flawed therapist? In other words, like a human being therapist. And it wasn't until several years later that I saw what I was writing, because I could finally see my own story from a trauma therapist's eyes. And I went, oh my word, I have complex PTSD. That's what this thing is that I've been trying to solve in all of these ways. And it has ultimately never been solved, because all of the things that I was doing were not trauma informed or trauma specific therapies or tools. Trauma lives in the body and the nervous system in this different way than I was cognitively trying to approach my issues. I have complex PTSD, and it's a result of narcissistic abuse. It's not just the alcoholism. It's that deep emotional, psychological abuse. I was given the silent treatment for weeks, months on end. I didn't exist in my own home. It was like I was dead to the people that were meant to take care of me. And then go out into the world, into your day, go show up for school like nothing is going on. The unpredictability of the addiction, the walking on eggshells, the outbursts, the grooming, the way that my stepdad confessed that he was in love with me, and the way that he tried to make me love him back, and all of these things. I had talked about some of this stuff in therapy, but it was from this very cognitive talk therapy kind of a place. I had written about all of this stuff in my inventories. But what I now know is that when it whittles down to my part, there's something that went missing in that for me. I think it was helpful to look at it from my side of the street and to show up. But on the other hand, I can see that part of my trauma response growing up in that environment, so maybe you have all heard of the 4 F's: fight, flight, freeze, and what we now know is the fawning trauma response. The fawning trauma response is a very common response in childhood. It's sort of the most primitive of the 4. And it is basically the heartbeat of codependency. It is that I will abandon myself and what I need and what I think to try to take care of you because I need you to survive. And I was stuck. So what can often happen with trauma responses is it's not a conscious thing, right? These are instincts. It's just the way that the body reacts in order to try to keep you a little bit more safe and maintain whatever connection is there, even if the connection is so dysfunctional. And it was a big go-to for me in childhood. So like I said before, I had this imprinting, this way that I learned to cope, which was largely through the fawning trauma response. And then I carried that unhealed, not knowing it was a trauma response, thinking in some way it's just my personality. Quite frankly, one of the reasons that I ended up probably becoming a therapist was in part a trauma response. I get to show up for you. Your needs are more important than mine. I don't really exist in this relationship. I only matter as I can be of service, right? That it's this thing that I was doing in every relationship. Here I am engaging in this chronic fawning trauma response, which already tells me I have to fix it. I can't be in a safe relationship. Relationships are not safe. I need to hold the entire burden for this thing in order to cobble together any kind of a relationship at all. And then when I acknowledge some real resentments that I have, and all roads lead back to my part, in some ways, the steps enabled me to stay stuck in this chronic fawning response with these two ideas. One is that resentments are the number one killer. And anger is the luxury, all of that language, coupled with really always coming down to sort of my part of things. The reason it became problematic is that we can look at the fawning trauma response on a spectrum, and it lies on the other end of the fight trauma response. So the fight trauma response in its healthiest aspect is I can engage in conflict. I can have a voice, right? I can be a person in the room. That's like the healthy expression of the fight response. It can obviously lean more towards violence and bullying and things that are not so healthy. But on the end of the spectrum, so there's fawning. I only exist if you see me. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to abandon myself, people pleasing, all of those tendencies, codependency, and the fight trauma response. In order to heal from an overactive fawning trauma response, I have to move more towards the middle where I have more flexibility. And what that means is leaning towards a fight trauma response. So guess what a lot of people need who are stuck in fawning? They need to know that it's okay to be resentful. They need to know that anger is a healthy, natural, human emotion. What we do with it, do we need to be mindful of that? Absolutely. But to have a fight response at all is a very life-giving, affirming, healthy experience to have. And for a lot of people who grew up with childhood trauma, that fight response was snuffed out.